Hi, it's Robin. My patron Andy DeGeorge asks, can you give an example of how to create and manage partitions and directories on a 1581? The user's guide isn't much help. There are a lot of parameters, it seems, track and sector length, etc. It seems a bit much for the average home user. I definitely will answer that, though I've been wanting to talk about the Commodore 1581 disk drive, a few other aspects of it as well. So I'll take the opportunity and just roll this into one video looking at this drive. I want to point out that two Commodore YouTube channels that I follow also recently made videos about the 1581, so I won't try to duplicate what they've done. Check out Graham at Commodore Cave. He made an interesting video about the 1581, and so did Amiga Love. I'll show the thumbnails there. Check out those videos. I'll put a link in the description, and if you haven't already subscribed to them, I recommend it. So if you're not familiar with the 1581, it's the last disk drive that Commodore made for the Commodore 8-bit series. And while all the previous disk drives used 5 1/4 inch, this final one uses double-sided, double-density 3.5 inch discs, just like the Amiga does. Just in case you can't get a sense of the scale of this thing, here is a classic 1541 disk drive. So you get an idea of how much smaller the 1581 is. Here's the back panel of it. Mine took a little bit of damage here. The 1581 has dip switches on the back here, so you can configure what device number. So here I've got configured to device 9. And it also has an external power supply. Here's one of the power supplies for it. There's two different styles, and this is the one that here mentions the legendary 1571-2 and the 1581. And it outputs both 5 volts and 12 volts because of the drive mechanism. The 1581 uses an MFM mechanism. With appropriate programming, it's capable of reading double-density MS-DOS disks as well. Physically, the drive mechanism is a 2-head, 80-track, 10-sector, 512 bytes per sector drive, but Commodore split each of those 512 byte sectors into 256 byte sectors, just like all the other Commodore drives, and they also logically combined the 2 sectors on the top and the 2 on the underside, so that you actually get, instead of 10 sectors, there essentially is 40 sectors for each of the 80 tracks. So I'll just make sure that this is a blank disk. Yeah, we do have a flashing red light there. I don't know how visible that is. Okay, so we'll do a format here. Open 15, that's just the file number. Comma 9 is the device number. Comma 15 is the command channel, which I talked about in the previous video about the printer interface Easter egg. This is one of the strengths of Commodore devices, is that whether it is a disk drive, a printer, whatever, you use the same kind of commands to talk to any kind of device. My disk, and they give it a 2-digit ID. So it should click 80 times, once for each track. Are you counting? I think I'll fast forward that. So I'm just going to use these full open commands at first, and then I'm going to switch over to using wedge commands. I've got my Super Snapshot plugged in today, but if you have Jiffy DOS or any other command wedge, of course I totally recommend that. Typing in the long form Commodore disk commands is not fun. Okay, and we'll load it in. And list. Okay, so there's our blank disk. Instead of the regular 664 blocks on a 1541, you get 3,160 free blocks. That is including both sides in a single format. So it's about 2.5 times the total storage capacity of a 1541 if you include flipping the disk, or almost 5 times otherwise. Okay, now to make a partition, also known as a directory, on 1581, it is an involved command. So again, we'll open 15, 9, 15, and then we'll print number 15. And here we go. It's a backslash, the 0, and then a colon, and then the name of the new partition. So we'll imaginatively call it partition 1, a comma, a quote, and then plus a character string. This is to be able to send a character through. Really, we're wanting to send it a numeric value, like a single byte number, but we're going to send it as a character string because that allows us to encode any value from 0 to 255 as a single byte. Some of these values we could send through inside the quotes, but that gets tricky to figure out and not all combinations are possible. I should say that making partitions on a 1581 I think was very much an afterthought. As far as making a partition, it's okay, but as far as using it as a subdirectory, which is one of the potential uses, it's really clunky. Okay, this here is the CMD FD2000, and this is like the unofficial successor to the 1581. It uses high-density disks instead. It can store twice as much, and it also has a much more elaborate file system. When SD card drives, like the Micro IEC and the SD to IEC came out, they mimicked the operating system of these drives and other CMD devices because they really perfected it. I'll make a video about that sometime. On the FD2000, you can just send a MD command, make directory, and that is it. It takes care of it all for you. Those are true subdirectories. But instead, what you have to do with this is first make a partition. And I really only recommend doing this on a fresh disk. It gets really dicey trying to do it after you've already saved files to it. Okay, so you have to give it the track number that you want the partition to start at, very low level. So track 1 is the first one, and that's what I recommend. And then the starting sector must be 0. Sorry about the wraparound there. It must be 0 if you want to then format this as a subdirectory. If you're just trying to make a partition just to block off an area of the disk, that was the original intention of these commands apparently. And then you would have to use your own low-level routines to read data off of it. Sure, there is some use for that, but that's not what the typical user would want. So basically this has to be 0. And then we're going to send the number of sectors, the low byte. Again, not very user-friendly. So if you just want to make a small partition, like say 200 sectors, or blocks as we call them, so this number must be at least 120 if you want to format it as a directory. And it also must be a multiple of 40 because it needs to take up a complete track. Each track is 40 sectors, and partitions have to block off full tracks, again, if you want to format it. If you don't, then you can be more flexible, I believe. And finally, it's the high byte of the number of sectors. So if you want to make yourself a 1,000 sector partition, you take 1,000 and divide it by 256. So that would be 3 would be the high byte. Oh, let's do that, eh? And then the remainder is the int of 1,000 divided by 256 times 256. 232. And we can make sure that that's right. 232 plus 3 times 256. Yeah, is 1,000. So that's ugly. That's basically we're transferring a 16-bit value in a low byte, high byte format, which is a big part of like assembly language programming. And finally, at the end, we have to add plus, quote, comma C. And here we go. There. And that's how quick it is to make the partition. Just going to start using the super snapshot command wedge. Tell it to talk to device 9, just with number 9. Now we can just use the F3 for the directory. Okay, and you see that's formatted the disk. It's used 1,000 blocks or 1,000 sectors and has 2160 remaining. And this is different. Over here it says CBM. And you're probably used to seeing PRG here and some other SEQ. So this is a new file type that was created for the Commodore 1581. Oh, and also if you're a longtime C64 user, you're probably used to seeing a 2A up here. That's the format byte. And finally on the 1581, they changed that to this 3D. Okay, so now what can we do with this? If we go the @command /0 partition 1. Okay, it's now entered that partition. But if we try to do directory, we get a blinking red light again. Press @return to see the error, drive not ready. That's because that partition is not formatted yet. So rather tediously, we also have to format that. So we can again use that @new command. Best practice just to call it whatever you already called the partition at the lower level, call it that at this next level too, and whatever, an ID of P1 for partition 1. Okay, and I did count, and it clicked 25 times, and 25 times 40 is 1,000 sectors. So 1 click for each track during the format. Okay, and now that we've formatted it, we finally have our partition created, or subdirectory. On CMD devices, they have true subdirectories, where you don't have to pre-partition and format and have a fixed size. True directories have a dynamic size. They can grow and shrink. And you'll notice that there's 960 blocks free, even though the partition is 1,000. That is because one full track, 40 sectors, is reserved for the directory and the BAM and so on of the partition. That's just a built-in overhead. Okay, and then once you're in the subdirectory, it acts just like its own disk, where if I write a program like hello, and I save that to device 9, and now you can see that file. We can type new, and the program's gone. Load, (9). There it is. Run. Hello. Okay, and that's about it. And to go back to the root directory, you just type the / on its own as a command. There we go. And now we can see that we're back at the root directory. Okay, some other things I want to cover. Did you know that the 1581 has some Easter eggs built in? And there's not much of a hunt for these. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet. The webpage for eeggs.com or whatever, their entry tells you to use like UJ or something. But if you do that and then read the command channel, it just gives you the copyright for Commodore DOS back again. And they also said UK is an Easter egg. But if you do that and read the command channel, the computer just hangs up. So anyway, the correct command is sending B- question mark and then reading the command channel. Okay, and the software is by David Siracusa and the hardware by Greg Berlin. So, and there's another one, B- and asterisk, dedicated to my wife, Lisa. Presumably that is David's wife, since he's the programmer. Isn't that nice? And a strange bug is that if you plug a Commodore Datasette in, of course, always turn off your computer when you do something like this. Okay, we'll load the directory. Okay, and that works. Then all I'm going to do is on the Datasette, press play, press stop. Wasn't even a cassette in there. And now we'll try and load the directory again. And the computer freezes up. So there's a huge incompatibility between the 1581 and the Datasette. Now, that probably didn't bother most people. It's kind of hilarious that this is like the very most primitive, the first data device that Commodore ever released, really. Well, not this particular unit, but the cassette drive that's essentially unchanged from the PET, and the very final 8-bit storage device Commodore made, and they do not get along at all. Now, there are 2 ROM revisions for this, but this is the second one that's in here. I burned it myself, and that does not fix the incompatibility. I've heard that Jiffy DOS for this might actually fix the bug, but I haven't tried that yet. And that'd be ironic because Jiffy DOS doesn't even support the cassette, but of course it can go in the drive, but be disabled on the Commodore side, and then the Datasette may work. I don't know. Let me know if you've tried that. And just a couple other remarks about that 1581, the 2 ROM revisions. The old one is part number 318045-01, which was possibly used right from 1987 when the drive was released, all the way until 92, and then bizarrely in 92, revision -02 was released. So I find that hard to believe that Commodore didn't release that new update until 1992. Seems odd that they would ever bother after 5 years. But anyway, apparently the differences, according to All About Your 64, thanks to Megavalp for finding this for me. Apparently the new version ignores the ROM checksum, presumably because they changed it and they didn't want to recalculate it. And then there's also a patch applied. I don't know what that patch does, but the final one, disable interrupts during job execution. Apparently it's possible for an interrupt to occur while the drive is processing a job, and then presumably it would hang or crash and you'd lose data. Sounds like a serious bug. It must not have occurred all that often, but I guess in the right conditions, that would be a very bad bug. And the final thing I want to look at today is just dealing with the idea, or I guess the rumor, the legend, that no software ever came out on 1581 disk. It's true that few, if any, games ever shipped on 1581, apart from a big exception that I'll show you in a moment. Okay, but this is the 1581 demo utilities disk that came with the computer. And let's try loading this Showbam. So there's a number of programs on this utility disk. You can find it online. Okay, and let's hit R to read the BAM. And this is the block allocation map. You can see down the left-hand side is the track number, and there are 80 tracks. Across the top are the sectors. So you can't quite see it. You have to scroll a bit. Down the left, that's only the first 20 tracks. We'll scroll down. Okay, so there. Track 30, track 40, 50, 60, and 70, up to 80. And now basically every disk is going to have something on track 40, even if it's just freshly formatted, because that is where the directory lives. So let's look at that disk that we just formatted. And I think if we press R to reread it. Okay. So you see there, track 40 on the left, there's 4 sectors reserved. That is the directory. And then when we made that partition, we made it starting at track 1. There's 25 tracks. 25 times 40 is 1,000. So there you go. You can see how neatly that matches up, that the bottom of the partition is right there on track 25. So that's a neat little tool. You should be able to download a copy of that disc. It's a handy one. And programmers really liked 1581 discs, so this here's the Software Guild. In the late 90s, I bought this from Roger Lawhorn, and this is a collection of all the source code and GEOS programs that he wrote over the years. So that's 2 discs there. Okay, and here's a neat thing. The Mailink on disk, this was like a users group over snail mail, and for a while they had a newsletter I subscribed to, and they also had a disk version. And so they would mail out a bunch of programs. There's the newsletter on what says side A. But of course these aren't double-sided, so anyway, I don't know. Side A and side B assorted C64 programs, and most months they would include this little directory listing. It's pretty cute, showing all the programs that were on for that issue. So I got that for out the year 2000. There was a lot of Commodore stuff happening in those years that you might have missed out on. September and November. Here's some GEOS clip art that came on 3.5. Of course, the 1581 and then the later CMD devices were very popular with GEOS users because when you're doing things like printing, using clip art and everything, more disk space is always good. 1581, of course, wasn't primarily for games. It was primarily for power users, as I discussed in my Super CPU episode a little while back. And here's a commercial program, Bible Search. So it's the main program here. Program disk. I'm actually not sure why I ended up with 2 versions of it. Oh, yeah, this is the NIV version and the King James version. And then there's concordance and so on, various texts, NIV and King James. So I know that was a fairly popular product for people who are into that sort of thing. Yeah, so in 1991, this was before people had internet access, and they were still using their Commodore computers. So that was a way of being able to search all that text quickly. Relatively quickly, anyway. And finally is Loadstar Magazine. They shipped it for years. I subscribed to this, and even I did some work for them. I wrote for them a bit and submitted some programs. And every month they would mail you a disc of software. If you got the 1581 version, it would all come on one disc. You could get it on 5 1/4 inch disc, but then it had to come on 2 double-sided 5 1/4 inch discs. And you're always flipping discs and everything. This is so much more convenient. Just pop the disc in and enjoy the whole issue. So here's issue 145. This was about $10 a month. And you got lots of programs. And there's articles to read, instructions. You can print it out if you want. Print parts of it out. A lot of it's actual programs, but there are also articles on here. So you just get an idea. When people say that there was no software on 3.5 inch, well, look at this. Each one of these represents a month. You know, so much work went into these. And this lived on into the 2000s, actually. I've got a second box of them here. There was even a special Commodore 128 version here. That was quarterly. Yeah, these are all the 128 versions here. This was like a special issue called The Complete Programmer. That had a lot of interesting programming articles. Let's see, how far back do we go? There we go. All the way back to, this one, the door popped off. Issue 199 in the year 2000. And then another editor, a friend of mine, this is Fender Tucker, who ran it up to issue 199. And then my friend Dave Morman took it over until issue 247, 248. Actually, I'm going to be talking about Loadstar more soon. But anyway. Alright, so that's a bit of a look at the 1581. I think there's still more I could have said, but anyway, maybe another time. Alright, thanks for watching. Thank you to my patrons, especially thanks to Andy for the question. Alright, if you haven't subscribed, please do. And don't forget to check out those other videos about the 1581. Links in the description below. and give those guys a subscribe as well if you like what they're doing. All right, thanks to my patrons. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.